Okay, welcome everybody to session 2. In this session, I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the law of comparative advantage. By the way, be sure to check in the syllabus. Session 2 and Session 3 are going to focus on Chapter 2 from our textbook. But there's one concept in their law of comparative advantage that deserves its own session. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. Except before I go on to that, I looked through the textbook, realized I don't think the textbook ever mentions the word invisible hand. And even though I mentioned that in session 1, I sent an email to my good buddy, Pete Betke, asking if that's true. I'll find out. We'll find out eventually as we read the whole textbook. But it's not in the index, invisible hand at least. But I want you to know a basic idea what the invisible hand means, even though it's not in the textbook, and that Adam Smith was the one usually credited for coming up with that term. On Dropbox, I've listed 2 new readings, one of which it's something like 02 dot notes on invisible hand, something like that. So be sure to read that. So first, one thing I want you to know, okay, first, as I said in session 1, you should know who the father of economics is, Adam Smith. You should also know about the time when he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. You should have a basic idea about what the invisible hand means, and it's the basic idea is that in a lot of instances, when people just pursue their own self-interest, even though they don't intend it, they may end up doing the public good. And I gave one example in session 1. I said, what if we said there's 20,000 people, 20,000 cars that want to get to work, and there's only 4 lanes on I-66. Efficiency or the public good would be that you divide up the lanes about evenly. 20,000 cars, put about 5,000 in each. Now, one way to achieve that would be to have the government mandate it and have some benevolent dictator say, okay, you first 5,000 cars, you take lane 1, you second 5,000 cars, take lane 2, and so on. But another way is just let everyone drive, and you can see that there's about an equal fraction of cars in each lane on any given day, and that happens, which I'm calling the public good, efficiency. That happens strictly because everyone's just following their own self-interest. So that's a case where everyone's just following their own self-interest ends up working toward the public good. We'll see some more examples of that as the course goes along. But that was one of the main points of Adam Smith. And he says, like, in just about any profession, you have, say, a butcher. The butcher, most butchers, I would argue, they're only in it for themselves. They want to make money and feed their family. But they end up doing the public good, which is getting meat to lots of people. And that's the idea, the main idea from the invisible hand. Now, on those notes, first thing, it'd be almost surely, I'd say, a test question is going to be like, who was the one who coined the phrase invisible hand? The answer is Adam Smith. When did Adam Smith write? About 1776. Another question I could write. Here's the notes. Note this passage. So if I wrote by directing industry in such a manner, blah, blah, blah. If I put that on the exam, you should be able to say, I said, who wrote that? You should know, oh, Adam Smith. Another good test question is if I put that passage but left out invisible hand. I just put, he's led by and blank blank. Okay. Fill in the blank, the 2 blanks, and you should be able to say invisible hand. That also would be a very good test question. Okay, so that is invisible hand. Okay, now on to law of comparative advantage. So, I want to begin. In my view, if you list the all-time great ideas in economics, what are the most important concepts, ideas that anyone has thought of? What are they? And here's my list. I've written them down. Number 1, It's demand and supply curves. By the way, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later. They didn't exist. They hadn't been invented yet by the time of Adam Smith. Not only that, we'll talk about David Ricardo, who is of the all-time great 5 to 10 economists. Adam Smith is one of them. David Ricardo is another. And in that list of such great economists, usually David Ricardo is the next one chronologically. David Ricardo, I think, was born sometime around 1800. I think sometime around the early 1800s was when he wrote. But regardless, I know it was after Adam Smith, and it was before Alfred Marshall, who was the inventor of supply and demand curves. So that's number one. So everyone kind of knows economics is about demand and supply curves. Number two is the Coase theorem. We're going to talk about that. That's from Ronald Coase. Actually, number 2 and 3, I think, are about tied, but I put Coase theorem slightly ahead. Number 3, law of comparative advantage, what we're going to do today. Then number 4 is invisible hand. Okay, so last week we did number 4. This week we're going to do number 3. Here is one of the main ideas or main policy implications from the law of comparative advantage. And it says, and it involves an economic fallacy that lots of lay people make, lots of people who have not studied economics will make. And it's suppose you have two countries, and one of which is better at producing all goods than the other country. Suppose Mexico, or better, or can do it more cheaply. Suppose Mexico, because labor is cheaper in Mexico, can produce everything more cheaply than we in the United States can. Lots of people would say, well, if you have that, you would never want to have free trade. If you're the United States, you'd never want to have free trade. That's just going to hurt workers in the United States, and it's going to end up hurting the United States. And the United States would be better off putting up some sort of protectionist measures, some sort of trade barriers to Mexico. And the law of comparative advantage says that that's not true. We can show with trade, even in that situation, when one country is better or can produce goods more cheaply than the other, all the goods, you still want to have trade. The trade can make both countries better off than how they would have been without trade. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it addresses a fallacy, and it's kind of hard. A lot of people can't quite understand this. First, let me say, here's another good test question. This is a good chance this will be on the exam. I will say, for any good, suppose Mexico can produce it more cheaply than the U.S. True or false? The U.S. is better off if it places restrictions. The answer is false. Okay. True, same thing. Mexico can produce things more cheaply. True or false? If there are no restrictions on trade, Mexico will benefit from. Even if there are no restrictions on trade, Mexico will benefit from trade. The answer is yes. Mexico will still want to trade with the U.S., even that, and that's part of the law of comparative advantage. Same thing if I said instead of more cheaply, I said suppose the U.S. can just produce it more efficiently with fewer person hours than Mexico. Same two type questions. You still it's false that makes you want to put trade restrictions, and it's true that in this case, U.S. would be better. U.S. would still want to trade. So in general, you should know this. In general, just all economists are in favor of free trade. And one reason is because this law of comparative advantage. Once you know that, you see, oh, okay, I can see why trade is good, and why it's a good thing if countries do not put up barriers to trade. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just doing some warm-ups. First, I'm going to try to motivate why this is so important, this law of comparative advantage, and why I want you to really concentrate and make sure you learn this concept. So one thing real quick, sometimes it's called the law of relative advantage. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm going to call it the law of comparative advantage, but if I slip up and say the law of relative advantage, I mean it as a synonym. Relative advantage and comparative advantage are synonyms. Okay. Okay, and then I also put some reading, so it's something like O2 dot notes on comparative advantage. And in this reading, I've put one, know who David Ricardo is, and that's an economist that worked around the early 1800s after Adam Smith, and he's the one who's responsible. David Ricardo came up with the notion of the law of comparative advantage. Um, in general, I just want you to know the concepts, but in some cases, I want you to know who did it. And this is one case. David Ricardo is such an important person. I want you to know, if I say, it's a very good chance I could ask the question, who was the one who first derived the law of comparative advantage? The answer is David Ricardo. Okay, next, I want you to know who Paul Samuelson is. So in the old days, 1970s especially, there was only one economic textbook for principles of economics, like first semester economics, and it was Paul Samuelson's book. Everyone used that book. Now there's lots of them. But he is a great economist. He is the first American ever to win a Nobel Prize. And I want you to know he generally leans left in his politics. Another economist, Samuelson died a few years ago, but another great economist, Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner. Paul Krugman, like Samuelson, generally leans left in his politics. By the way, Krugman is a columnist at the New York Times. I think twice a week he has a column that you can read. Now, I also want you to know, I think probably most of you already do, that George Mason economists are generally right-leaning. They're generally free market in their views. In fact, I think it is true of all economics departments in the country that produce PhDs, George Mason is probably the most free market oriented, as professors who are most friendly to the free market of any economics department in the country. Okay. So despite this, George Mason professors are generally on one side, Krugman, Paul Samuelson on a lot of issues on the other side. We all agree that the law of comparative advantage is one of the all-time great economics ideas, and we also all agree that in general it implies that free trade is good. In general, maybe not always, but in general. I want you to know that I put in a passage from Wikipedia about Paul Samuelson. Someone once challenged Samuelson to name one theory in all the social sciences that is both true and non-trivial. And he said, law of comparative advantage. Okay, I want you to be able to know that. Then I also want you to read Paul Krugman's article, Ricardo's Difficult Idea. It's fine if you just skim it. I want you to get the general idea of it, and I want you to note that one, if I put a paragraph passage from it, that you could identify that it was Krugman, especially if I made it multiple choice, something like that. And I want you to see how frustrated Krugman is with public intellectuals, these supposedly smart people who will put on this pretense that they understand the law of comparative advantage, and they'll give some sort of short shrift to it, acting like they respect it and understand it. Then they'll have their next sentence will reveal, no, they didn't understand it. And that's Krugman's point, that a lot of these public intellectuals, he's basically calling them stupid. Okay, so it's pretty remarkable that someone is willing to do that. And he's saying, but this is so important, understanding the law of comparative advantage. I think I got to do that. And he's told other economists, hey, don't overestimate these guys' intelligence. A lot of these public intellectuals really are too stupid to understand the law of comparative advantage, or at least they don't understand. But I think Krugman, he doesn't quite say it, but he almost says, I think he thinks it, that some of these public intellectuals are actually incapable of understanding it, that they're not smart enough. No matter how hard they tried, they will never understand it. I disagree with that. I think that I have a way of teaching it that I think any person can have a good understanding of law of comparative advantage, and that's what I'm going to try to do in this lecture today. Okay, so I want you to read that, read my notes, at least skim over that article by Paul Krugman. And note that even though he's on the left, and most of us George Mason economists are on the right, we all agree that the law of comparative advantage is very important. Okay. Um, okay, now on to explaining what that means. Law of comparative advantage. Um, Here is first term to know. Okay. Um, there's two concepts. By the way, in this video, on this video A, absolute advantage comparative advantage. Those are two concepts. First, let me say the first one is easy to understand. Absolute advantage, it's going to mean exactly what common sense definition says it is. The comparative advantage is the one that's tricky. Okay, that's why we call it the law of comparative advantage. We don't call it the law of absolute advantage, because the law of, if there were such a law, everyone would say, oh, that's trivial. Everyone can understand that. Law of comparative advantage, and defining it, trying to say which country or which person, which of these has the comparative advantage. Sometimes it's pretty tricky. The absolute advantage is always easy. Okay, that's the first thing to understand. Make sure, if you like, stop the tape, repeat that to yourself. Okay, absolute advantage is easy. Determining who has the absolute advantage is easy. Determining who has the comparative advantage, that is a little tricky. Okay, what we will do in this, we will talk about. By the way, I'll say this again later. So with absolute advantage, we'll always look at two countries or two people. With absolute advantage, one person or one of the countries could either have the absolute advantage in neither of the tasks, in only one of the tasks, or in two of the tasks. Okay, it will depend on the situation. Okay, but comparative advantage, okay, at least when there's no ties, and I'll try to explain that more in a second. And by the way, in this class, I will never put a test question where there's a tie. So in this question, assume there's never a tie, which means that always, when we look at two people or two countries, one will have the comparative advantage in the first task, the other will have the comparative advantage in the second task. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then once you learn those terms, the idea is that if you want to increase the economic pie between them, you want to make efficiency, you want to get things so that sometimes both can be made better off. What you generally want to do is make each person or country concentrate in the task for which they have the comparative advantage. Okay, that's where I'm going. That's the whole idea behind this. And once you do that, you say, hey, you know, if there's two tasks, you know, one is making computers, the other's making shirts, you say, hey, U.S., you concentrate on your comparative advantage. Maybe that's making computers. Mexico, you concentrate on your comparative advantage. Maybe that's making shirts. Do that when you produce things, and then we'll trade after you do that. And usually we can make people better off, both countries better off, than when they just focused on, each did not focus so much on their comparative advantage. Okay, so that's where we're going. Okay. First, I want to do a warm-up. Okay, so I want to explain a little anecdote. Turns out it's true. My wife, her name is Victoria. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary, by the way. When we got married, it turns out I did not marry a good cook. Okay, turns out she is now. This is a great thing. Trust me, if you marry someone who improves on something, that's always fantastic. But when we got married, I was the better cook. Meanwhile, she was the one who was better at washing dishes. Okay, so you could say, okay, when it's time, if we're going to split the work up, one of us is going to cook, one of us is going to wash dishes. What does it make sense? It makes sense to make me do the cooking and let her do the washing the dishes, okay? Because we each do what we're better at, okay? Um, Now, what gets tricky is now where I'm going to go with this is that my wife, throughout our advantage, her name is Victoria, started getting better at becoming a cook. And all of a sudden, she passed me. All of a sudden, she's a better cook. Right now, she's a better cook than I am. She's also better at washing dishes. And we'll talk about who should do which. Okay, now if she's better, you say, "Oh, she should do both." Well, that won't work. One of us has got to wash the dishes, the other one's got to cook, and the question is, who does what? Okay, and at one point, so she started off a worse cook. So I was the better cook. I'm here, she's here. Eventually, she ends up here. There was at some point where we were tied. Okay, something like second year of marriage. I can't remember exactly. So we're going to talk about that. Okay. So, okay, this is going to seem a little trivial, a little boring. This is a warm-up exercise. If it seems too obvious, that's good, but don't get complacent. I want you to really get a firm understanding of this anecdote, okay? Once you do that, I think this will help you understand when we start moving to countries and which country should produce which good, okay? So, let's start off. Okay, case one. This is early in our marriage. Okay, Victoria better than Tim at dishes. T better than V at cooking. Okay. If that's the case, it's pretty obvious. You'd say, okay, T should cook, V should do dishes. Okay. That should be pretty simple. Okay, now let's move to, and by the way, when we do this, we will say, okay, T has absolute advantage at cooking. V has absolute advantage at dishes. Okay, so that's what we'll say when we define absolute advantage. This is exactly what kind of the common sense definition means. It's who is better at it. Okay. Okay. Now let's consider case two. Okay. Now this is, like I said, about our second year of marriage, where all of a sudden Victoria has been getting better at cooking, and she's about tied me. She's tied me at cooking, but she's still better at dishes. Okay, so the better at dishes, T and V tied at cooking. Okay. Now I think everyone agree that even in this case, the way we should divide up the work is we should still do it the same. So I'm still better, she's better at dishes, okay? Who should cook? Well, if we make me cook, we're both just as good. But if we did it the other way, where she cooks and I'm doing dishes, the dishes are not going to be done as well. So the idea is it's still kind of the same, you know. So it would make sense that we still do the same thing. So T should cook, V should do dishes. Okay. So now we would say T has an absolute, V still has an absolute advantage at dishes, but neither has an absolute advantage at cooking. By the way, I told you we're tied. I'll never put an example like this on the exam, okay? But I'm going to do it here. Okay, so next, and by the way, let me put the final point. When we talk about comparative advantage, I'm still loosely speaking. I'm going to define it more formally in a second. But it basically means who should do which task. If one's going to do one task, the other's going to do the other. You say who has the comparative advantage, or who do you think should do this task, who should do the other one. That basically means comparative advantage. So we would say here, Tim also has a comparative advantage at cooking. Victoria has a comparative advantage at doing the dishes. Here, when we're tied, we say Tim should cook. So T has comparative advantage at cooking. V has comparative advantage at dishes. Okay. So I hope everyone can see that would make sense in this case too. Okay. Now, let's go to case 3. Okay, so this is like year 3 in our marriage, where Victoria has passed me in cooking, and she's still better at dishes, but she's just barely passed me. Okay, so case 3. Okay, still V better at dishes. Okay, now V better at cooking, but T almost as good. Okay. So what I want you to think about, so if you were advising us in our 3rd year marriage, you'd probably say, Tim is worse at both. Okay, Victoria has the absolute advantage in both, but you gotta have one do the dishes, one do the cooking. What should Tim do? So, well, it makes sense for Tim to do the cooking, right? He's a lot worse at dishes, but he's almost as good at Victoria at cooking. So it makes sense for Tim to do the cooking in this case. Okay. Same as if they were tied. So I've just made it so we're almost tied. We've just switched a little. We should do about the same thing. So the same thing. We're going to say, even in this case also, let me write that down here. T should cook. V should do dishes. Okay, and the same thing's going to be true when we define comparative advantage. We would say Tim, since he's the one who should cook, he's the one who has the comparative advantage at cooking. Victoria has the comparative advantage at dishes. Okay, and we'll try to define that a little more formally later, but that's where we're going. Loosely speaking, comparative advantage, it all has to do with who should do what, who should do which task. Okay. Okay, now we're still in the warm-up. Okay, I'm just talking about a married couple doing dishes or cooking. In a second, we're going to get to like a more usual economic case. We're going to look at 2 countries producing 2 goods. But before we do that, let me just write down what I'm going to call the recipe for determining who has the comparative advantage. Say who. Later we'll look at countries. I may say what. Okay. So this is the recipe. So if you're on an exam, remember how to do this. Okay. And by the way, first, remember this. Okay. On my exams, one person country will have the comparative advantage at one task. The other person or country will have the comparative advantage at the other task. So if we can somehow, if you can determine that, say, Victoria has the comparative advantage at dishes, then you know necessarily Tim has the comparative advantage at the other task, cooking. Okay. So it will never be the case that one person has the comparative advantage at both tasks. That will never happen on my exam. Okay. Nor will it be that someone has the comparative advantage at neither task. We'll always split them up one for one. Okay. Okay, so here's the recipe. A, if one person has an absolute advantage at one task and the other has an absolute advantage at the other task, then the answer is easy. In this case, it's easy. So this is like the first year of my marriage. Oh, wait. Yeah, that's like the first year of my marriage where I was better at cooking. My wife was better at dishes. I had the absolute advantage in cooking. She had the absolute advantage in dishes. It's easy. I should do the cooking. That means I have the comparative advantage in cooking. My wife has the comparative advantage in dishes. Okay. So in this case, you say who has the comparative advantage in which task? Well, it's just the same as who has the absolute advantage in the two tasks. Okay. The harder case is always if one person has an absolute advantage at both tasks. Okay. And it's difficult. Okay. But what you do is you ask, okay, look at the person or country who is disadvantaged and ask which task is he almost. Okay, I'm going to put that in quotes for now. Later we'll explain almost. It turns out you have to do a math problem, use some division. So you have use some 7th grade math to determine what almost means. But now put it in quotes. Look at the person who's disadvantaged. Ask which task is he or she or that country almost as good at. Okay. So, in that case, my 3rd year of marriage, I was worse at both cooking and dishes, but we said I was almost as good as my wife at cooking. Okay, so in this case, you'd say the person asks which task is he almost as good at? The answer is cooking. So in this case, you would say Tim has the comparative advantage at cooking. Okay, and I said always the other person will have the comparative advantage at the other task. Okay, so Tim has the comparative advantage at cooking in this case. Victoria has the comparative advantage at dishes in that case. Okay. Okay, that is the warm-up exercise. Okay, this is video lecture part A. It took about 35 minutes, a little bit longer than I quite intended. So now I'm going to go into more details. I'm going to make some of these terms a little more precise, but I wanted you to have a warm-up on this. So I want, if you can just understand what I just said, you have a working definition of what law of comparative advantage means, and you have I think a pretty good idea on the exam of trying to determine which country or which person has the comparative advantage, and that's a little bit difficult. But if you can just understand that, you should do at least fairly well on the exam. So what I would encourage you to do is watch this video one more time. Cement this knowledge, this warm-up exercise. Really cement that and really understand it. Memorize what I've explained about comparative advantage, absolute advantage, things like that. And then go on to part B. Okay, I'll see you there.